So as I was preparing here this week now to think through the passion narrative with you, we're already in the trial sequence. We've gone through at least a good portion of the trial sequence before Pilate and before Herod, according to Luke. We've noticed things that are in the Lucan account that are not in the Markan and Matthean accounts, and we've noticed where Luke has added things to his account that are not found in the other two synoptic writers or the fourth gospel. So today, what we have to start with an omission, because it's at this point in the narrative that Mark and Matthew and the fourth gospel all have the soldiers mocking Jesus, the Roman soldiers mocking Jesus and torturing him. Now, Luke omits that entirely. And as we've noticed, he in a sense is trying to exculpate Pilate from the responsibility of what's happening. And so one of the things that will occur is that in the very next text, Pilate, of course, demands that accedes to the demand of the Jews for their request for Barabbas. And we've already noted the play on words there. Both of these are sons of the Father, but their father's different, okay? One is the Father in heaven, and the other is the father of lies and death. And when I get to a moment here, I want to delve a little bit into Renee's thesis here about the Passion narrative. But before we do that, I just wanted to note some of what Luke is doing here, because it's going to come into play with the Passion narrative itself. So all three of the synoptics agree that Pilate releases Barabbas, and it says this in the Gospel of Mark: having scourged Jesus, he delivered him over to be crucified. In the Gospel of Matthew, having scourged Jesus, he delivered him over to be crucified, word for word. Here's Luke. He released the man who'd been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, whom they asked for, but Jesus he delivered up to their will. Now, who is the their? Well, in the context, it's this crowd, because immediately in that, Luke, again, he omits the mocking of the soldiers, and it says, as they led him away. So now we have the burden shifted right over to the religious authorities in the temple police. And again, Luke kind of removes any traces of Roman responsibility for the death of Jesus. And that's why I mentioned last week, when Luke is writing his gospel, if it's in the 90s, you can't date these things precisely. You really can't. But if it's in the 90s or in the late 80s, you have to ask what kind of pressure is the Christianity in his area under? What is their relationship to Rome? If I have a kind of a working hypothesis that the writer of Luke Acts is from the city of Philippi. Philippi was established as a Roman colony where ex-soldiers would come, and part of their payment was so much farmable land, and they, as landowners and citizens of the empire, moved up in the city bureaucracy and that kind of thing. So if this is the case, for Luke to kind of remove Roman responsibility would not be unusual. And we see the same thing in the book of Acts. Paul is consistently being harassed by the Jewish authorities, but when it comes to the Roman authorities at the end of the book of Acts, they're willing to work with Paul. You know what I mean? So Luke has this very kind of pro-Roman, pro-empire slant in what gets often omitted. That's number one. So there's Luke, this breaks up, by the way, the concept of unanimity in the mimetic theory. You need unanimity for a scapegoat to work. And remember back in chapter 23, verse 14, it says, after Jesus saw both Herod and Pilate, Pilate and Herod became friends that day. So the mechanism is doing what it's supposed to do. But when Luke removes Rome from the equation, he's also saying that the culpability lies just right here. Whereas in Mark in particular, and in Matthew, Roman culpability is also there, and in the fourth gospel especially, although Pilate in the fourth gospel is an interesting figure, but we'll leave that for now. What we have to deal with here is Luke's pro-Romanness. Now, it says all three synoptics agree that they found a guy named Simon of Cyrene. They made him carry it would have been the long wooden piece of the cross. It's not the cross isn't made up like here. It's the crossbar that goes this way that Simon has to carry. The posts are already in the ground. They're up on the hill. They've already been dug. The posts are up, and then the nails are put in, and they're hoisted up and slotted in place, and then the feet are nailed in, and you know the rest of the story. So Simon carries this crossbar. Now, only Luke has. This is only in Luke. There followed him a great multitude of people and women who bewailed and lamented him. There's that woman theme again that we keep finding in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus turns to them and says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and your children. For behold, the days are coming when you will say, blessed are the barren, the wombs that never bore. I thought I went over this last week. I must have. But anyway, then you'll say to the mountains, fall on us, cover us. He's trying to help them realize that this event that's happening to him, this scapegoating phenomenon, is going to eventually lead to a complete mimetic crisis in which Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies, as we saw in chapter 21, and they will be besieged, and the destruction will be terrible, and it was. Then they come to the place of the skull, and they crucify him. All four Gospels note that there are two criminals, okay? It's at this point where we have that saying that's a textual variant, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. I've discussed this so many times. You know that I think it differentiates intention from action when it comes to atonement. Girard called this the first literary allusion to the non-conscious. But at any rate, they cast lots to divide his cloak. This casting of lots is very important because how do you pick a scapegoat? You cast lots. Well, in this case, the scapegoat's had, but the lots are still played in order to gain access to his garments. And then all four Gospels note the inscription, this is the King of the Jews. And John, the writer of the fourth gospel, has the full title, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, the I-N-R-I that you see on the cross, Jesus Nazareth Rex Judaeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews in Latin, is what it stands for. Now, there are two robbers crucified him, one on his left, one on his right. Those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross. Also the chief priests and the scribes and the other ones with the scribes mocked Jesus. That's Mark and Matthew. Here's just Luke. All the people stood by watching. But the rulers scoffed at him. Notice how Luke has broken the unanimity again, right? First takes Rome out, now he's taking the people out. Now watch what he does. The soldiers mock him, saying, if you're the King of the Jews, save yourself. And then you have the conversation that only occurs in Luke between Jesus and the two thieves. One of the criminals who was hanged railed at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. This is a guy who recognizes, live by the sword, die by the sword. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus says, truly, I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Notice how Luke has broken the unanimity of the mechanism here by having the one thief side with Jesus. Are you with me so far? He keeps breaking this unanimity. This is what the revelation of the cross does. We're going to go to Renee in a minute here for this. But what Mark and Matthew do is they show the mechanism in a sense, the way it happened. They're just phenomenologically observing everything, and it's getting written down, and doesn't have the oral tradition. But what we have in Mark and Matthew is an account where everybody's culpable. Everybody is culpable. And Luke, again, as you go through this narrative, he begins removing culpability, and he just lays the burden right on the chief priests, right on the religious authorities. We'll come back to, well, no, it was now about the 6th hour, and there was a darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, when the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Luke is the only one who notes the temple curtain being torn in two at this point. Mark and Matthew now have a saying that Luke omits entirely, and that's the saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? You will notice in Mark, it's in Aramaic, Eloi, E-L-O-I, and Matthew has just turned it into quite simple Hebrew, Eli, Eli. And you'll notice in Mark as a writer is going to tell you that people are going to misinterpret this saying. Here's what Mark says. My God, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, look, he's calling Elijah. He isn't. He's citing the opening line of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is a psalm that really clearly, even in some of its rather strange, fine details, indicates a man under persecution like this by a community, a man who's unjustly being criminalized and violated. And it ends with not a plea for retribution or vengeance, but with a cry for vindication. Psalm 22 does. And as I've noted before in the Jesus-Driven Life and other books, you can't breathe while you're on a cross, so everything's going to be short and pithy. And if Jesus wanted to remind them to try and bring to their heads that they're participating in this process, okay? And while they may have seen the figure of Israel in Psalm 22, Israel suffers, we're suffering, we're Jews, people don't like us, that Jesus now historicizes this and says, you need to see yourselves as the persecutors. Of course they can't. And so they have to have another explanation. So they say he's calling Elijah. Well, in the same fashion, my friends, the penal substitutionists who want to argue at this point, Jesus felt abandoned by God, or, and why would Jesus feel abandoned by God? Oh, it's because God was pouring out his wrath on Jesus and this and that and the other nonsense. That too is a misunderstanding, but it's a sacrificial misunderstanding. The Elijah thing you could chalk up to any number of things, right? But the penal substitution approach to this text is absolutely sacrificial when it's intended to be used to expose the sacrificial. That's Psalm 22. It's why Jesus cites it. To expose the sacrificial, the penal substitutionists come and clamp down a sacrificial interpretation on that. But Mark has already let us know that this is going to be misinterpreted. Luke omits that entirely, and instead has Jesus cried with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, and he breathes his last. There's one last little piece here. That's the centurion who's keeping watch over Jesus. This is the mark now. When the centurion who stood facing him saw that he breathed the last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. Matthew, the centurion and those who were with him, there's Matthew always adding things, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place. They were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Here's Luke. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, certainly this man was innocent. It's right there. The Roman soldier is not looking at Jesus as a divine figure. He was looking at him as an innocent scapegoat. Luke is bringing that out. That's his point for the saying with regard to the centurion. And then Luke has all the multitudes who assembled to see the sight. When they saw what had taken place, began beating their breasts. So here the multitudes are starting to repent, right? It's as though they're starting to recognize with the centurion that Jesus was innocent. You don't have any of that kind of repentance in Mark or Matthew or John. But in Luke, you have this deconstructing of the unanimity process and this awareness that this is what this event means. Oops, hang on. Okay. Now, also in all four Gospels, his acquaintances and all the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance and saw these things. There's the women again as part of the narrative. Now we come to the burial. It's not complicated. Luke basically is going to follow the Matthean pattern at this point, and he tends to omit what Matthew omits in Mark's rather long-ish narrative for this. They lay him in the tomb. The women who had come with him, there's the women again, from Galilee, saw the tomb and how his body was laid. They then returned and prepared spices and ointment. And then only at this point does Matthew add there's a guard at the tomb. And that's the end. That goes all the way through the burial now. Here's the thing about what Luke is doing and what Matthew and Mark are doing and what the fourth gospel is doing when it comes to the passion narrative, my friends. The writer of Mark, clearly structured around the temple theme, just as Luke is showing that the sacrificial system doesn't work anymore. And in fact, one of the things about the Markan structure that's fascinating when you get into the design of the text is two things. One, a fair number of the Markan narratives correspond more to Elijah and Elisha narratives than they do to Moses. It's the first gospel, Mark, has Jesus being compared with Elijah and Elisha, the two greatest prophets in Israel's history. Matthew will shift that to Moses. Jesus is the miracle worker like Moses. The fourth gospel picks that up big time. And Luke does the same thing. So that's the first piece. Second piece is, as the Markan writer is writing it, he's writing at the same time as the destruction of the temple. So this is right here in his field of vision, and he's having to account for that in light of the death of Jesus, which he does remarkably well. Matthew and his gospel, the eschatological destruction of the temple, which is already in his past, but that's being announced here in his gospel as future from the historical Jesus, you have this sense in which the problem isn't so much the sacrificial system in Matthew. That's not the problem. The problem is the follow through on the covenantal promises of caring for the neighbor that are part of the structure of the Decalogue, that to love the Lord your God is to love your neighbor. And so Matthew's emphasis is rather a criticism of the religious authorities in their inability and unwillingness to love the people around them. You know, the broken, the cast out, et cetera, the leper, this, that, and the other. Luke's passion narrative now, in distinction from Mark and Matthew, the whole gospel's focused on the temple. We saw in the beginning it starts that way. We'll see it ends in the temple. The whole central section is like I said, a beeline to Jerusalem, to the temple, with a lot of non-sacrificial stuff in there. And now here we have the chief priests of the temple. They are the ones. This leadership is the group that is being now strictly to blame. You get to the fourth gospel, none of that blaming really matters. What the fourth gospel is trying to show us in its very profound way is that the death of Jesus is the end of the old creation. It is finished. That is, the true human has now been completed and can be raised from the dead to become a whole new species. The tetelestai of John 19, it is completed, doesn't refer to some atonement work. It's the completion of the creation. Jesus is the true completion of creation. And it's also on the cross that we have all the sacramental signals of blood and water and spirit being poured out from that cruciform Christ. So each of the synoptic writers and the writer to the fourth gospel are going to construct a passion narrative with a different emphasis. If you want to go, well, what's historical and what's not historical, I guess you could do that if that's important to you. Me, you know, I'll work with whatever I got. I'm working with the text. The text is all I have to work with, so I got to work with the text. To me, I'm not so interested in what happened as I'm interested in is how are the writers showing me what happened? What's their perspective? What are they doing? Remember, we referred to this as the textual Jesus in the context of the fourfold Christological paradigm, okay? Now, in Girard's book, The Scapegoat, at the beginning of chapter 3, he points out what are going to be the markers of myth. So I'm going to read this to you. It's the first paragraph. Each time an oral or written testament, in the case of the Gospels, they're written, an act of violence that is directly or indirectly collective, and it is, we question whether it includes the description of a social and cultural crisis. That's what we're looking for. We see the story. There appears to be an act of violence against somebody, and there is the concept of a mob, one versus all, that notion. And when we see that, we have to go, is there a social and cultural crisis happening? So that's the first thing we start looking for. And he says, what are we looking for? What are the indicators of this social cultural crisis? Number one, a generalized loss of differences. A generalized loss of differences. We saw that especially in the Markan and Matthean passion narratives, where everybody gets caught up in the mechanism that will eventually kill Jesus. The second stereotype, crimes that eliminate difference. Now, Jesus is accused of some pretty heinous crimes. And those accusations put him out there in kind of like Jeffrey Epstein land, right? I mean, the last thing anybody wants to be accused of in the world, falsely accused of, is pedophilia. because it will ruin your life if you're falsely accused of it. It will ruin your life even if you're innocent. Your life will never be the same. Okay? That differentiates you. So in this case, to say he claimed this and this and this kind of authority for himself, or this is who he was, or he's claiming to be Messiah or the Son of God or the Son of Man, it's this crime of eliminating differences. That's his crime. He's saying, I'm different than you. And then whether the identified authors of these crimes possess the marks that suggest a victim, the paradoxical marks of the absence of difference. That's the third stereotype. Now, where do we see that? We see that especially in the mocking on the cross. They're saying, Jesus, you're just like us. You see, you're just like us. You thought you were different, but you're really not. We have all three of these marks right here that are found in myth, also in the Passion narrative. So their existence, that is, that we have these three things, Girard says, when we come to myth, we're not talking about gospel, he's talking about myth. If we find these things in a myth, we can be sure that the acts of violence were really real. The crisis was really real. The victims are chosen not for the crimes they're accused of, but because of the signs they bear that make them different. That's why lame people, blind people, anybody with a physical deformity were used as human sacrifices. And then finally, the import of the operation is to lay the responsibility for the crisis on the victim and to exert an influence on it by destroying these victims or banishing them from the community they pollute. Girard's argument is that the Passion narrative itself will break down all three of these things. We just watched as we saw Luke change the history of the narrative to turn that narrative into a bit of revelation, okay, by showing that the unanimity was beginning to break down already there at the cross. There might have been unanimity leading up to it, although you got to put Rome aside, but after that, you start losing that unanimity until it's only left there with the scribes and the chief priests. The unanimity is broken down, and thus the mechanism is broken down, and thus Jesus becomes a failed scapegoat. Let me emphasize that. Jesus is not a scapegoat. If he was a scapegoat, then the process would have worked and we would have never had the Gospels written. We only have the Gospels written because he is a failed scapegoat. He doesn't, his death does not manage to change the social crisis. It doesn't bring peace. In fact, it's going to actually exacerbate the crisis, and it will continue to exacerbate that crisis clear up until the present day. That's why Rene will say that, let me get the quote for you here. Turn. Wrong book, page 50 on this one. Here we go. That's why Rene will say that his approach to mythology is scientific. What makes it scientific is the gospel revelation. I'm going to read here a little bit from The One by Whom Scandal Comes. The Gospels are therefore both what comes to an end from a chronological point of view, that is, all mythology is written, and then the Gospels are the final piece of this great big literary cultural puzzle. And the Gospels are what come at the beginning in the order of understanding. That is, we will never be able to interpret myth or cultural mythology, we will always end up being a part of it if it wasn't for the Gospels. The Gospels are what shed light on that process. We are at the end of a 2,000-year period of this light shedding process, and it took us until the 20th century and the Holocaust for us as a species to become aware that we often kill indiscriminately and unjustly, and it's just not right. And that's why the 20th century became the century of human rights. He continues, Rene continues. The interlocutor says, in other words, you understand what some readers don't understand. And Rene says, I do. Most readers have understood, I hope, but the difficulty is convincing them of the scientific character of my work. The word scientific does not apply here to the interpretation of the Gospels, but to the interpretation that the Gospels give of mythologies. The Gospels read myth. And that's the background of my argument that one of the things the New Testament does, if not the primary thing, is to teach us how to read the Hebrew scriptures, which is largely composed of literature in the victim of travail, although there are those little pieces in there from time to time where you actually have almost a pure myth, like in the Achan story of Joshua 7, and in some narratives in Samuel and Chronicles and Kings. But the Jewish tradition is not myth. The ancient Near Eastern tradition out of which it comes, the Greco-Roman world in which Jesus is in, those are cultures, that's myth. The Jewish tradition is the tradition that is beginning to recognize the innocence of the victim. And we've been over this over and over and over and over again. It is the gospel, and it is the gospel alone that shows us that there's only one way out of either myth or this limbo where one is innocent but still retributive, thus still embedded within the larger circle of violence. And that way out is really made clear in that saying in Luke, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I remember back, in the late 80s, early 90s, using this phrase, the forgiving victim. And then James Allison completely independently began using it. And James and I got together and were discussing it one day. And we both came to this awareness of this kind of process about the same time, but we didn't even know each other. And when you now have the completion of the narrative, what comes after this? What comes after this is a complete and total surprise. We don't even know what comes after this, if this is the first time through the story. But if it's the first time through the story, you already know, as a reader who's hearing this big narrative about Jesus of Nazareth for the first time, that he was bringing something so different to the table that it had primarily to do with one's view of God and the issue of sacrifice in relation to that God, that his contemporaries had to get rid of him. Because if they didn't get rid of him, they understood the implications of his thinking. Eventually, they would become passé. They would have no value or no use. And so, of course, they had to go make sure that he was taken out. Excuse me. Yeah, I do want to hold off on the resurrection for its own talk. So you may unmute and we can discuss this bit.
So if Jesus was a failed scapegoat, if he had been successful how would the results for the Jewish community been any different?
Well, they may have at that point felt as though he was culpable, and they would have all walked away justified, just like they did with the other two thieves that died. Everybody knew they were culpable, even according to Luke, the thief knew he was culpable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's not doing some kind of Oedipus thing, like, I don't deserve what I'm getting. He's saying Jesus, when is innocent, he doesn't deserve it. I'm a murderer, I deserve it, right? I did this.
Mm-hmm.
So um shoot, then I lost the train on that. The question was,
How would the effect of
oh, okay. So had it worked, had everybody said, you know what, this Jesus was a loser, we were right to kill him, they would have all gone back to life like nothing mattered. There would have been those who would, like Luke records, again, fictionally, that would have made friends. The friend of my enemy is my friend kind of stuff.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that the apocalyptic implications of all the mimetic crises going on in late Second Temple Judaism wouldn't have come to full flower in 70. They may well have. And in fact, Jesus was warning against it. So I think it was inevitable. He says in the synoptic tradition, my Father's house was meant to be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of lestes. And lestes is the term that is used for a nationalistic, zealous revolutionary. Okay, somebody who's defending the zeal and the honor of God. They were doing God's holy work. That's how they perceived themselves. And Jesus uses that term of a brigand, a robber that goes out on the road and robs people for their money so that it can be applied to the just cause of liberating Israel.
That's good.
To what extent, Michael, does the resurrection bring about the lack of peace, or interrupt the peace? So I suppose what I'm saying is that for 3 days after the crucifixion, there was arguably a peace, but it was, and the disciples were terrified. They were in the upper room, and it was the resurrection that actually broke the peace.
Well, they would have had, the disciples would have had no peace, because at the top of their heads had to be, if they took out the leader, who are they coming after next? You with me?
Yeah.
I'm surprised they stayed in Jerusalem. I'd have gone back to Galilee immediately. You know? So
are you saying that the fact that the disciples had no peace is the sign that there was not the peace that the scapegoating myth requires?
Well, I can't say that they had no peace historically. I can't, I'm making kind of a fictional guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the text doesn't say that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm where I'm going to go. Everybody knows where I'm going to go with this when we get to the resurrection narrative and the use of the word shalom as eschatological. In other words, Jesus is coming to us from the future, where God reigns all over all. He's coming to us from God's future. And the first word out of his mouth is shalom. That's the eschatological world. Everything is at peace. Everything is fine, guys. Everything is fine. You have nothing to fear here. and then we'll get to that. I think, to me, those are the most powerful words, and the words that I mean, it changed their lives. It turned their life upside down, because now they were not going to be the victims of a divine persecutor, and you do have in the tradition Jesus giving to Peter a personal resurrection appearance, and to James a personal resurrection appearance. So even Paul mentions that in 1 Corinthians 15. So I think it is important that to these two leading figures, Jesus gives a personal appearance to, and just as he did with the Apostle Paul.
Thanks.
And don't you think if they thought that Jesus hadn't appeared to Paul, they would have said to him at some point, Jesus appeared to me personally, I got a personal resurrection appearance? They would have used that argument, but it didn't happen that way. They knew that Paul had seen the risen Christ outside of the context of the more than 500 brothers and sisters. And that's why it says, I'm a latecomer. He uses the term for an aborted fetus, or I should say, not aborted, but a fetus born prematurely, out of time,
Michael, I just see in a personal situation that I've recently seen, I'd like to just share how I sort of see this applying. I went up and spent 5 days with my mom, and she's in a nursing home, and it's a hard situation. But the scapegoat idea, I see that the members of the nursing home have the pressure from the higher ups about how this is supposed to act.
Mm-hmm.
They got the pressure of, not enough staff they get is poor. And so they sort of need a scapegoat. And so my stepdad, who's not exactly the most lovable guy in the world, but he has sort of like become their scapegoat, and they plastered him as this black, this black whatever. And there's some justification, but in reality there isn't. But I just saw that just talking about the unity, because in a way my family, who doesn't like him, unites with the nursing home, and my stepdad becomes the bad guy,
right?
When in reality the real bad guys is the situation itself, the pressure of the management,
The institution.
but he's an easy
target.
He's an easy target.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I thought about that this weekend. I wouldn't have seen it without our teaching.
Without the gospel.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
If we could take a couple of steps back and do a run up to the bit about the marks of the myth. I'm going to have to listen to this recording at least twice more, but that to help me for those occasions. I think you were saying that the three marks. The first one is a social crisis.
No. The social crisis is what we can conclude exists because of these three things.
Okay.
In a narrative.
Okay.
The three things are a generalized loss of difference.
Okay, if we stay with that for a moment.
Yes.
Going into the crucifixion, going into the trial and the passion, there are at least three different groups: the religious group, the Roman group, and the mob. So there is difference there. There's no loss of difference yet.
They all
So-
agree, that Jesus deserves to be tried.
Yes.
That's the loss of difference. They all agree he's guilty.
So they buried their hatchet, really.
Yep, yep.
And they do that. Okay, so they do that to reach an uneasy peace with each.
They do that so they have unanimity for when the second sign emerges, and that's crimes that eliminate differences. So they can accuse the victim of these most heinous things.
I get you. So in other words, they're not going to accuse the victim of things that would differentiate between them as different groups.
Right.
They're going to choose something that's kind of alien. Yeah.
That differentiates Jesus from all of them.
And in this case, it was what, his blasphemy, his.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the third has to do with the way that these first two are told about. And it's so Girard says, and whether the intended authors of these crimes possess the marks that suggest a victim, the paradoxical marks of the absence of difference. Now, was Jesus the King of the Jews?
No.
Sure,
Yeah.
he was.
All right.
Was he the Son of God?
Yes.
Was he the Messiah?
Yes.
He was all of those things, right?
Yeah.
So you can't say he's being falsely accused, can you?
No.
No, what can you say? They have misinterpreted what those things mean, and they're attributing their understanding of the categories to him, and that's false.
Okay. So the definition of that third one, just run that past me again.
Okay.
Absence.
Let me read the up to that. Each time an oral or written testament mentions an act of violence that is directly or indirectly collective, we question whether it includes the description of a social and cultural crisis. That is, a generalized loss of differences. The first stereotype. Second stereotype, crimes that eliminate differences. And whether the identified authors of these crimes possess the marks that suggest a victim. The paradoxical marks of the absence of difference. And the fourth stereotype is violence itself, which will be discussed later in the chapter, Girard says. It's the whole problem, Richard, of a mob whose identity has been sought in these basically conflicts, all these conflicts that they're having one with another, okay? That's where their identity is. Jesus offers them a whole different identity as a community of peace, as a little flock, as beloved of the Father. They're going to reject that. And so as a result, they're going to collapse into undifferentiation, and they are going to need to have something that will facilitate the process of differentiation again. So they pick a scapegoat. And they all go against that scapegoat because now they can differentiate. And when the event is over, they can go back to differentiation again and start their mimetic conflicts all over again. But it's not, you see, the thing is, in reality, when it comes to mimetic conflict, it's not our differences that create our real issues. It's our sameness. That's why all the talk today about diversity is getting the human species nowhere. In fact, it's kind of taken us off the edge of certain cliffs intellectually and otherwise. We need to stop and go, we're all in the same boat together, man. And when we get that, we can maybe start to appreciate we don't need to be casting people off the ark in order to survive. I don't know. We're I don't know. I see the gospel a lot throughout church history as the little seed, the little plant, with some big influencers, like a Saint Francis, like a Luther, like a Bonhoeffer, like a Simone Weil. But gosh, I don't see the gospel. It feels to me like the gospel is still unheard when it comes to the church. I know it's unheard when it comes to the world, but I feel as though the church doesn't know the gospel or hear the gospel. And it's still stuck in its sacrificial approach to this non-sacrificial message. So, but again, Renee accounts for that and says, that you can't go all the way to nonviolence all at once. It's a process. Sure, taking a long time.
A couple things, Michael. So just a thought on what you just said. I think that like it's in personally, I feel like until religion is snuffed out, we we'll kind of be stuck in that cycle. And it's that, Jesus didn't give anybody a religion. That's not what he was doing.
Yeah, Jesus did not come to start a religion.
Exactly. So I think that the church doesn't know the gospel because they can't. It doesn't align with the fundamental building blocks of what they are. So anyways, I had two things. The first thing was regarding Barabbas. I was thinking about this because you mentioned it last time. So the kind of the play on words, it means son of the father.
Mm-hmm.
Is this, it seems almost like they're rejecting the Messiah that Jesus is, and that Barabbas is really the Messiah that they want.
That's correct.
And so is that kind of they're accepting they want Barabbas released because that's who they want to take, and they want to get rid of Jesus because it's they don't want him as their Messiah.
What's the one difference between Barabbas and Jesus? They're both proclaimers of this reign of God that's coming, right? I mean, Barabbas is probably an apocalyptic sectarian, right? What's the difference between them? The one uses violence, the other one doesn't.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Do you think that's historical in any way, or do you think
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And I'm gonna have to look here if because I'm almost positive it's before that. I'm almost positive that I thought the Lucan narrative, the Johannine narrative. Yeah, the Johannine narrative even mentions it. You have a custom, I should release one man for you at the Passover. Will you have me release for you the king of the Jews? And they said, no, not this man, but Barabbas. So Barabbas is mentioned in all four Passion narratives.
Okay. So you think that's why it's historical?
I do. It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. It
just makes a delicious, ironic sense that his name happens to be Bar Abba.
Yeah.
If you're a Christian, you just have to go, holy cow. We're talking about the Heavenly Father, and you are of your father, the devil, who lies and kills.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other thing was, so verse 43 in that segment that's only in Luke, at the end he says, so the thief says, remember me when you come to your kingdom, and he says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. But I guess my question there is, why would Jesus say that even though, because he doesn't get resurrected for 3 days, right? His
Yeah,
ascension to
yeah.
heaven.
So look, what's Jesus doing? What's he telling this guy? You broke the unanimity. You stood by me. I'm the guy that gets to rule paradise. I'm going straight there. You come with me. We don't want to interpret this somehow chronologically. Don't do that, and try to figure out, was paradise before the resurrection, or did Jesus go here? Or no, this is just another way of saying, I've got your back. We're both going to die, but I've got your back because I'm the king of death.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. I was thinking, is it almost like,
He's going back to the garden. That's the Paradisio, is the Garden of Eden. He's going back to the garden before it's spoiled.
okay. Okay. So you don't think it's maybe just talking about that there's like he's really just talking about death in the sense that like
I do not think he's talking about a place or a space. I think he's he's giving this thief hope that where he's going is new creation.
okay,
Yeah. And he's using the mythology. Paradise.
right. Okay. That makes sense.
Did the Jews have a concept of restoration of the garden?
Okay, so that's a challenging question because they do have a creation theology. They don't really no. Okay, for me, I would say no.
Yeah.
Or if there is, it's very minimal. I mean, the Jews never focused on Adam as the progenitor of sin in the human species. They never, the rabbis at least, never went that direction. Paul was the first one to do that.
You mentioned there to Tommy a phrase that you'd used at the outset, which was, which I need to bear in mind, that the cross breaks unanimity, and I suppose that is what Jesus was saying when he said, "I come not to bring peace but a sword."
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it wasn't the sort of sword that we think of, but it was, I come to draw lines between people who would want to non-differentiate them, well, who would want to come together at scapegoating me.
Right. Yes.
I need to think that through. There is a mocking in Luke, but it comes
Much later.
No, it comes earlier.
Oh, does it come earlier?
It's in 22.
Oh, right. Yeah, I remember when I remember now. I remember when I was thinking about this, about why isn't Luke consistent? About taking out all references. I don't know. Yeah, verses 63 and 64. Yeah.
What is verse 31 saying? It's the he says, for if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Like in context to what you were saying before.
Oh, verse again.
31.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You ever tried to burn green wood?
Mhm.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, no.
Right.
Mhm.
He's saying this this crisis is fresh. This is the beginning. It's the beginning when the wood is green. And they're trying to burn it. What's going to happen when everything is dry? It will get burnt to the ground.
Okay.
In other words, they're not paying attention to the fact the wood is green, but they're throwing it on the fire, trying to get something out of it. They're not going to get out of it what they want. But their situation is going to progress to the point where they can start throwing everybody on the fire, and they're not going to get out of it what they want.
Gotcha.
That's the logic it is to me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Would you say that Luke has, well, I think you've said he's got more of a sense of the scapegoating process and the need to draw attention to it than Mark and Matthew, and John just bypasses all that.
I wouldn't say John bypasses it, Richard. I really would not say that. The writer of the fourth gospel is so subtle. But what I saw Matthew doing was trying to retain the sacrificial and the temple, so that the problem wasn't the religion itself, wasn't Judaism itself. Okay, and to me, that's an okay move to make. And I see Luke, he has this passion narrative, and he knows how the mechanism works, and so he begins showing that even though everybody agreed that Jesus was truly guilty, once they got him up there, the minds begin changing, and the unanimity broke away, and thus Jesus becomes an absolutely failed scapegoat. And I don't want to talk about this today. When we do next time, I want to talk about the reason for the 3 days in the tomb. There's a very important reason for the 3 days in the tomb. And by the way, I'm of the in order to. I've been reading your the pieces you put out, Richard. You and your wife put out. I'm one of those that thinks Jesus dies on Thursday prior to sunset on Thursday. So sunset Thursday to sunset Friday, day 1. Sunset Friday is Sabbath into day 2. Sunset Saturday starts day 3.
Yeah, so it is 3 days, 3 nights.
So that's how you get your on the third day. Yeah. It really doesn't make sense if he dies on Friday.
No.
You don't get 3 days.
Well, you get
a portion, you get a little, you get what, 3 hours of Thursday, all day Friday, or all day Saturday, and then Jesus he's risen before the girls come out at dawn, But you do get the full 3 days if he dies on Thursday. You get that, but yeah.
And 3 nights.
And 3 nights, yeah.
Michael, do you think, I'm just kind of spitballing here, the idea that Luke kind of highlights this mimetic mechanisms more because his audience isn't Jewish, and because of the culture of Judaism and how they're already the victim in a way that it wouldn't be as easy to explain it to those people versus Gentiles who are outside of that.
I don't know that would be the motivation. I would say Paul's influence.
Okay.
I would say it's Paul's influence here on the writer that's helped him to see these things.
Okay.
Which for me is pretty cool. Because if you were to say, how would somebody that knew the Apostle Paul rewrite Matthew?
would any of them know of Paul's letters?
Oh, it's hard to say. I would imagine they would have heard that Paul sent letters to churches because they sent letters. That was letter writing was the early Christian way of communicating. That's why a good chunk of the New Testament is a bunch of letters. From Romans down through Jude, with the exception of Hebrews, really. It's a collection of letters. So you have 4 narratives and a bunch of letters with one sermon tucked in there, and then a crazy book at the end.
Yeah. It's a super comic. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Graphic novel, Christian graphic novel. Well,
Michael, there was one more thing. So when you mentioned that they were leaving the crucifixion site, they were beating their breasts, you said that they were repenting, that repentance.
yeah, well, that's what beating your breast is. It's woe is me. This is wrong. I did wrong.
Mhm.
You're mourning. You're recognizing something went off the rails here, and you're going, oh my God,
Yeah. So I was curious because I'm using the Oxford Annotated Bible,
Uh-huh.
and in the footnotes, for that one it says here beating their breasts indicates mourning, not repentance.
Well,
So
I would, yeah, okay, mourning, but mourning for what?
yeah,
I mean, what are they mourning? Oh, Jesus was a good guy. Oh, the Sanhedrin made a bad decision. The Roman authorities made a bad decision. We were
yeah,
part of it, but we're not going to. No. These very people recognize they would have been part of this.
yeah. Okay.
That's a silly footnote, in my opinion.
Okay.
What did
Yeah,
they have to be so sad about?
that's what I was thinking too.
So I think, Michael, you're making the point that Luke is making a very nuanced point, which is that there was the scapegoat mechanism taking place of undifferentiation, everybody agreeing, but some were more guilty than others, and that was
Sure. Sure. But in the long run, all were guilty. I mean, let me back that up. Not all are guilty. And the fourth gospel, you notice the first 3 gospels have the women at a distance. Okay.
Yeah.
The fourth gospel has Mother Mary and a couple other Marys and the beloved disciple right there on holy ground. You know what I mean? Right there next to Jesus. Close enough that he could talk to them. So again, is it historical? I don't know. It doesn't bother me. That's not an important question to me. Whether they were far away, whether they were near, it's a question of how do they function in the narrative? What are they doing? What are they bringing to light? What's their function? And in John's gospel, their function is to break the unanimity. And they do that.
I was just looking to check, but you're right. In John's gospel, it is the disciple. It's not John. It's not named as John.
No.
Yeah. So could be Lazarus.
Could be. And how bizarre that, and again, if you assume that Lazarus was raised from the dead, how bizarre it must have been for Lazarus, who's been to the other side and back, to be standing there getting ready to watch Jesus die and go to the other side and come back. That must have been strange. Anyway. Okay, guys. Thank you for a good time. Anything else? I'm good?
This is a deep one. Going to need a lot of thought.
That's right. Okay, well, look forward to seeing you all next week then.
Yep, thank you,
Hey.
Michael.
Hey, wait, bring Rosie to me. I'm gonna end the recording.